The neighborhood had always been quiet, one of those suburban enclaves where the biggest drama was whose lawn was the greenest. For Marcus Reed, a 34-year-old history professor, moving to this cul-de-sac was supposed to be a fresh start, a peaceful life, away from the noise of the city. He spent most of his weekends maintaining his backyard oasis, a modest but well-kept pool, clear and blue under the warm afternoon sun. That morning, as Marcus stepped outside with his coffee, he noticed her again, Karen Billings, the self-proclaimed watchdog of the neighborhood. She was standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, lips pursed, watching. She did that a lot lately. Watching. Marcus sighed, shaking off the unease. It wasn't the first time Karen had given him the side eye. Ever since he moved in 6 months ago, she had made it clear she didn't think he fit in. The way she lingered when had guests over, the passive-aggressive comments about his music being a bit much, even when it was barely audible, the disapproving glances every time he mowed his own lawn instead of hiring a service like everyone else. It all added up. Today, though, there was something different in her stance. It wasn't just disapproval. It was calculation. Marcus took a slow sip of his coffee and turned toward his pool. The water shimmered under the sun, perfectly still, perfectly blue. A deep, rich shade, thanks to the new chlorine tablets he had picked up last week. Nothing unusual, nothing strange. So why was Karen still standing there? As he turned back toward the street, her phone was already in her hand. He watched as she dialed. Her expression darkened, her mouth moving in tight, clipped words. And then she looked directly at him. Something in Marcus's gut twisted. A few minutes later, the sound of approaching sirens broke the peaceful quiet of the cul-de-sac. Marcus frowned. Who called the cops? And more importantly, why? Marcus Reed had always believed in minding his own business and treating people with kindness. Growing up in a tight-knit family in Atlanta, his parents had instilled in him the values of hard work, education, and respect for others, principles he carried into adulthood. After earning his doctorate in history, he became a professor at a local university, specializing in African American studies. Teaching wasn't just a job for him. It was a way to connect, to educate, to ensure history was understood rather than erased. When he moved into Crestwood Heights 6 months ago, he was hopeful. The neighborhood had seemed quiet, safe, a perfect place to focus on his research and finally have a home of his own. He didn't need much. Just a good coffee maker, a well-stocked bookshelf, and his small backyard pool, which he had personally maintained since moving in. But Crestwood Heights had its own unspoken rules. At first, the neighbors were polite but distant. They nodded when he passed, smiled just enough, but the conversations never went deeper than small talk. The only ones who truly welcomed him were the Millers, an older couple 2 doors down. Karen's been the unofficial sheriff of this street for years, Mr. Miller had warned one evening, shaking his head as he and Marcus chatted over the fence. If she sees something she doesn't like, she finds a reason to complain. Just ignore her. But ignoring Karen Billings was easier said than done. She had questioned Marcus about his car when he first moved in. Why didn't he have a luxury SUV like the other homeowners? She had commented on his music, even though he always kept the volume low. And then there were the long, assessing looks she gave whenever he had friends over, particularly his black colleagues from the university. Still, Marcus had made an effort to be part of the community. He attended HOA meetings, even though they felt more like passive-aggressive complaints disguised as discussions. He waved at his neighbors, struck up conversations when possible, and even helped Mrs. Carter carry groceries to her house once. He wanted to believe people were just slow to warm up. So, despite the tension, he went about his routine. Morning started with a cup of black coffee on his back porch, enjoying the peaceful sound of water lapping against the edges of his pool. Afternoons were spent on campus, lecturing students about history, about the way society shaped itself through time. Evenings often found him in that same backyard, book in hand, feet dangling in the pool, unwinding from the day. The pool had been his escape, a quiet, personal space, a place where, For a little while, everything felt still. But lately, Karen had been watching. Longer than usual. More deliberate. And today, she had finally picked up the phone. Marcus didn't know what she told the police, but something in his gut told him this wasn't just about a pool. Marcus stood frozen on his porch, coffee cup still in hand, as the wailing sirens grew closer. His mind raced through the possibilities. Had something happened in the neighborhood? A break-in? An accident? But as a patrol car slowed and then came to a stop right in front of his driveway, his stomach dropped. This was about him. The officer stepped out, adjusting his belt, scanning the house before his gaze settled on Marcus. He was middle-aged, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. "Afternoon, sir," the officer said, approaching. "We got a call about an unusual situation regarding your property." Marcus's brow furrowed. "My property?" The officer glanced toward the pool, squinting as if he expected to see something horrifying beneath the clear, blue water. Marcus followed his gaze, his confusion deepening. The water shimmered under the sun, undisturbed. "Yes, sir. A resident reported that your pool's color is unnaturally blue and that it—" The officer cleared his throat, as if he barely believed the words he was about to say. "Might contain hazardous chemicals." Marcus blinked. "You're joking." The officer let out a slow sigh, shifting uncomfortably. "Wish I was." And then, from the sidewalk, Marcus saw her, Karen, standing with her arms crossed, her expression tight with satisfaction. She wasn't even pretending to be discreet. She wanted him to know it was her. Marcus clenched his jaw, exhaling through his nose. "Officer, this is chlorine. Regular pool maintenance. You can test the water if you want." The officer scratched his temple. "I figured as much, but since the call was made, I have to check." Marcus stepped aside, motioning toward the pool. "Be my guest." The officer walked toward the edge, peering in. He leaned down, running his fingers through the water before bringing them to his nose. "Smells normal. No discoloration on your skin. No strange fumes." He straightened up, shaking his head. "Honestly, sir, I don't see an issue." Marcus folded his arms. "Then why am I standing here justifying my pool?" Before the officer could respond, Karen took a step forward, voice sharp. "I saw him pouring something in there this morning. And the color, no one else's pool is that shade. It could be some kind of chemical experiment." Marcus turned to face her. "It's chlorine, Karen. Pools need chlorine." Her eyes narrowed. It didn't look like chlorine. The officer sighed, clearly exhausted. "Ma'am, unless you have actual proof that there's a health hazard, there's no reason to assume wrongdoing." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't getting the reaction she wanted. Marcus could see it. The way her fingers twitched slightly, the way she rocked on her heels. But she wasn't done. "You should check inside his house," she pressed, her voice lower now, but still loud enough to carry. "If he's hiding something, it wouldn't be out here." The officer's head snapped toward her, his patience clearly thinning. "That's not how this works." Marcus felt the heat rise in his chest. This wasn't just about a pool. This was something deeper, something uglier. Karen wasn't afraid of his chlorine. She was afraid of him. Marcus tried to shake it off. The absurdity of Karen's accusations still lingered in his mind hours after the police left. He had hoped it was over. Just another one of her petty grievances. Another attempt to make his presence in the neighborhood feel unwelcome. But as the days passed, something gnawed at him. Karen wasn't just watching him. She was waiting. At first, it was easy to dismiss. The occasional glance from her window, the way she lingered a little too long on her porch when he came outside. But then, the pattern started to emerge, details that felt too deliberate to be ignored. She was always there, morning, afternoon, evening. Whenever Marcus stepped outside, even for a moment, Karen seemed to find a reason to be present, trimming her bushes, checking her mailbox, watering the same patch of flowers that didn't need it. And then the notes started appearing. The first was simple, a typed letter, left neatly in his mailbox without a return address. We like to keep Crestwood Heights clean and safe. Some behaviors are noticed. Some aren't welcome. Marcus had laughed when he first read it, not because it was funny, but because of how ridiculous it was. Was she really sending anonymous threats? Did she expect him to pack up and leave because of a passive-aggressive letter? He threw it away. But then another one came. Some people don't belong. Some people don't understand what's best for a community. He clenched his jaw as he read it, fingers tightening around the edges of the paper. This wasn't about his pool. This was about him. Still, he refused to let it get to him. He went about his days as usual, pretending not to notice Karen's piercing stares or the subtle disapproval in the way other neighbors spoke to him. But it wasn't just about their silence anymore. It was the way conversations stopped when he approached. The way people who had once exchanged polite greetings now avoided his eyes. The way the Millers, the only ones who had truly welcomed him, suddenly seemed hesitant. And then the sounds began. Late at night, just when Marcus was about to drift off, there would be noises outside, footsteps on the sidewalk, moving too slowly to be from someone simply passing through. The faint rustling of bushes, the subtle scrape of something against his fence. The first time, he brushed it off as an animal. The second time, he forced himself to believe it was just the wind. The third time, he checked, heart pounding. He crept to his front window, pulling the blinds back just enough to see outside. The street was empty, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. Everything was still, too still, and then movement, a shadow shifting near his backyard. Marcus inhaled sharply, muscles tensing as he backed away from the window. He grabbed his phone, hesitating before dialing. What would he even say? That someone might be outside? That his neighbor was watching him too closely? Instead, he waited. Minutes passed. The rustling stopped. The next morning, he found something new. A small, clear plastic bag sat on his porch, tied neatly at the top. Inside was a clump of something white, powdery, slightly crystalline. A note was tucked beneath it, this time handwritten in block letters. You should be careful. People might start to wonder what you're doing in that house. Marcus's stomach twisted. This wasn't just harassment. Someone was trying to set him up. Marcus stood frozen on his porch, the small plastic bag of white powder in his hand. His mind raced through 100 possibilities, none of them good. This wasn't just another petty move by Karen. This was something more dangerous. He could already see how this would play out if he made the wrong move. A call to the police. An officer arrives, sees the bag, and suddenly he's the suspect. No amount of reasoning or truth would change the fact that in their eyes, he fit the profile of someone guilty before proven innocent. He took a slow breath, forcing his fingers to unclench before he crushed the bag. He needed to think. Who did this? Karen was the obvious answer. But did she really take it this far? Leaving an anonymous letter was one thing. But planting drugs on his property? His pulse hammered as he scanned the street. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows along the quiet sidewalks. A few houses down, an elderly man walked his dog, oblivious of storm brewing inside Marcus's chest. But Karen's curtains were open, and she was standing there, watching. Her face was blank, no smirk, no gloating, just waiting. Marcus's hands trembled as he turned the bag over. The substance inside shifted slightly, catching the light. It was fake. Had to be. This was a setup, not an actual drug operation. But the police wouldn't know that at first glance. And Karen? She wanted him to react. To throw it away, so she could say he was destroying evidence. To take it inside, so she could claim he was hiding something. To ignore it, so she could escalate things even further. Marcus exhaled sharply. His body screamed for him to do something. Anything, but he forced himself to stand still. Think. Then a thought struck him. She wanted to control the narrative. What if he took that away from her? His heart pounded as he made his decision. Deliberately. He stepped off his porch and walked down the driveway, not towards Karen's house, not towards his car, but straight into the open street, where his movements were fully visible. Then, with a slow, calculated motion, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. His fingers clenched around the plastic bag as the line rang. 911, what's your emergency? Marcus's voice was steady, despite the fire raging in his chest. I need an officer dispatched to my address immediately. Someone has planted a suspicious substance on my property, and I believe it's an attempt to frame me. A pause. Then, can you describe the substance? I don't know what it is, Marcus replied, his eyes locked on Karen's house. But I need an officer here now, and I want them to know I made this call. Karen's expression flickered, and for the first time since this all began, she looked afraid. The weight of Marcus's decision settled in his chest as he waited on the curb, the plastic bag of suspicious powder still clutched in his hand. His pulse pounded in his ears, but his face remained impassive, controlled. This wasn't just about protecting himself anymore. This was about taking back control of his own story. Within minutes, the first patrol car arrived, its blue and red lights cutting through the quiet morning. Marcus remained where he was, standing in the open, making sure that any watching eyes saw exactly what was happening. He wouldn't give Karen, or anyone else, a chance to twist the narrative. A tall officer stepped out of the car, hand resting cautiously on his belt. You the one who called? Marcus nodded, holding up his hands to show he wasn't a threat. Yes, sir. I found this on my porch this morning. He carefully extended the plastic bag, making sure to keep his movements slow and deliberate. I believe someone's trying to frame me. The officer took the bag with gloved hands, inspecting it with narrowed eyes. He signaled to his partner, who came over with a field test kit. Marcus inhaled sharply as the second officer opened the bag and used a small dropper to apply a chemical reagent. A tense silence followed as the liquid settled. Then, the officer exhaled and looked up. It's fake. Relief flooded through Marcus's chest, but he didn't let it show. He wasn't surprised. This had never been about actual drugs. It had been about perception, about painting him as someone dangerous, someone who didn't belong. Karen's trap had failed, but Marcus wasn't done yet. I have reason to believe my neighbor may be involved, he said, nodding toward Karen's house. She's been watching me, leaving anonymous threats. I don't approve, but I know she's been trying to get me in trouble. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. Would you be willing to make a statement? Yes, Marcus said without hesitation. The turning tide. Word spread fast. By noon, half the neighborhood knew what had happened. Marcus watched from his porch as a second police car pulled up in front of Karen's house. Two officers stepped out, knocking firmly on her door. Karen hesitated before opening it, her face composed but pale. The exchange was too far for Marcus to hear, but he could see her gestures, sharp, defensive, laced with the privilege of someone who had always been believed without question. But the officers weren't backing down. One of them handed her something, a citation, a warning, whatever it was. It made her expression harden. She slammed the door without another word. For the first time, Marcus saw Karen lose. The sight should have made him feel victorious. And yet, he felt something else, something deeper. Karen had spent so much energy trying to tear him down, to cast him as an outsider. But what had it really gotten her? Isolation, resentment, and Marcus? He wasn't alone. Community speaks. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a knock at Marcus's door startled him. When he opened it, he was met with a familiar face, Mrs. Miller, the elderly woman from a few houses down. I heard what happened, she said, her voice warm but cautious. Are you all right? Marcus blinked. Of all the people he expected to check in, she hadn't been on the list. I'm fine, he said after a moment. Just frustrated. She nodded. I understand. More than you know. To his surprise, She stepped aside, revealing a small group of neighbors standing behind her. The Millers, the retired couple from the corner, a young father who often jogged past Marcus's house in the mornings. "We wanted to let you know," Mrs. Miller continued, "that not all of us agree with what Karen's been doing. Some of us," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "some of us should have spoken up sooner." Marcus studied their faces. There was sincerity there, maybe even guilt. For so long, he had felt alone in this fight. But maybe he hadn't been. Not completely. A lump formed in his throat as he nodded. "I appreciate that." The young father stepped forward. "Look, man, if you ever need anything, you let me know, all right? We look out for each other in this neighborhood." Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Maybe this was what real victory looked like. Not Karen being silenced, but people finally listening. A lesson in kindness. The next day, Marcus stepped outside to find something on his porch. For a split second, his stomach clenched, expecting another cruel note. But it wasn't a note. It was a neatly wrapped basket filled with fresh fruit and a handwritten card. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Marcus. We're glad you're here." His chest tightened as he read the words, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Karen had tried to make him an outcast. Instead, she had brought people together. And Marcus? He wasn't going anywhere. Moral and community message. At the heart of this story lies a powerful truth. Community is not just about where you live. It's about who chooses to stand beside you. Marcus's experience is a reminder that prejudice, no matter how subtle or overt, thrives when people remain silent. It only takes one person to stir division, but it also only takes a few to push back against it. When neighbors came forward to support Marcus, they weren't just offering words. They were reclaiming their community from fear and suspicion. Too often, people convince themselves that if something isn't directly harming them, it's not their problem. But injustice, left unchecked, spreads like roots beneath the surface, weakening the very foundation of the places we call home. Being a good neighbor isn't just about friendliness. It's about responsibility. Karen acted out of fear, out of a desire to control a narrative that didn't belong to her. But in the end, her actions backfired. Because hate may be loud, but kindness, when people come together, is always stronger. So the next time you see someone being treated unfairly, ask yourself, what kind of community do I want to be part of? Will you be the one who turns away? Or will you be the one who speaks up? Because real change doesn't start with grand gestures. It starts with everyday people choosing to do the right thing. And when we choose kindness over fear, unity over division, we don't just make a better neighborhood, we make a better world.